Hello, welcome to Cooper. Hello, welcome to Cooper Union for Typographics number 6. Hi, I'm Mike Essel. I'm the Dean of the Cooper Union School of Art, and I've been teaching graphic design at Cooper Union for 20 years. And the Cooper Union has been teaching type and lettering continuously for over 160 years. Typographics is presented by Cooper Union, Type at Cooper, and the Herb Llewellyn Study Center. Thank you to my Cooper Union family for all their work on typographics this year. Cooper Union was founded by Peter Cooper in 1859 to be open and free to all, independent of a person's race, religion, sex, wealth, or social status. We're all proud to support Cooper's mission, and we're especially proud that this year's typographics is free for all people joining us today. Thank you all so much for making time for our speakers and their important work, and thank you for supporting Cooper Union, and thank you to all the incredible artists and designers presenting today. All 4 curators of typographics were once curators of the Herb Llewellyn Study Center. All 4 of us have taught design at Cooper Union, and 3 of us are graduates. Please give me a virtual round of applause for my fellow curators, Barbara Glauber, Ellen Lupton, and Alexander Tachilowski. And now I'd like to thank our sponsors. Diamond sponsor, Google. Thank you to our platinum sponsor, Fonts by Heffler & Co. Our gold sponsor, Adobe and A2A Studio Solutions. Our silver sponsor, Commercial Type and Poster House. Our lead sponsors, Mark Simonson Studio, Production Type, Klim Type Foundry, Cooper Hewitt, Glyphs. Oh, I forgot to change the slides. I apologize. Let's try that again. I'd like to thank our diamond sponsor, Google, our platinum sponsor, Heffler & Co., our gold sponsors, Adobe and A2A Studio Solutions. Our silver sponsors, Commercial Type. Commercial Type and Poster House. Our lead sponsors, Mark Simonson Studio, Production Type, Klim Type Foundry, Cooper Hewitt, Glyphs, Occupant Fonts, Village, and Dual Type. I'd like to thank our brass sponsors. I'd like to thank our pixel sponsors. And I'd like to thank our association and media partners. Thank you to all of our sponsors for making this year's typographics possible. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Alexander Tachilowski. Alexander is a graphic designer, professor in design at Cooper Union, the current curator of the Herb Llewellyn Study Center, and my friend and today's MC. Please welcome Alexander Tachilowski.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's really an honor to be working with this team. This is our 4th year together, and I couldn't be prouder of our relationship. So thank you, Mike. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Barbara. And thank you, everyone. Really an honor to so welcome to Typographics 2020. I know we're remote, but we're so glad that we can make this work for everyone and to see so many faces here virtually, but we're with you in spirit. You're with us in spirit. So it's so nice to see everyone. We're really excited to spend these next few days together. We have a fantastic lineup today of 6 wonderful speakers. The schedule for the talks is posted on the website. You could see what's happening there. We have, of course, hashtags and handles. Use this if you post to social media. Also, feel free, obviously, to use chat. It's a wonderful space for connecting together. So hashtag. Oops, one quick note is we do have a virtual after party happening today and tomorrow and Sunday. We hope you join us tomorrow and Sunday as well for the full lineup of talks. But we do also have a virtual after party. The details of that will be posted in the chat, so keep an eye out for that. That's generously sponsored by Design Space for us, so keep an eye on that. And without further ado, we'll start the program. It is my honor and my pleasure to introduce the first speaker today. The first speaker today is Paula Scher. Paula is a legend who does not need an introduction. I think you're all incredibly familiar with her work. She is a partner at the famed Pentagram Studio located here in New York City. It's a role that she has had since 1991. Her work is known worldwide and is truly iconic. Her work is some of the most recognizable work, and I'm sure you're very well familiar with the amazing lineup of projects that she has done. She's here with us today to give us a look, a look back at the love story, her 25-year relationship with our neighbors at Cooper Union. For many years, we wish we were physically back in our space so we could be proximate to the public theater. It's something that I grew up attending Cooper Union, seeing every single day coming into school. I would see the posters that Paula was producing. So it's been amazing to see them, and it's too bad we're not physically there, but we're there kind of in spirit. So Paula is going to share her 25-year relationship with the public theater. It's a love story with that institution. And I'm going to check real quick if we have Paula. If Paula's there.
Here.
Yep. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Paula. Thank you so much for being with us today, Paula.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I wish I could see you all. And you wouldn't see me much more than this anyway, because I always speak in the dark. So without further ado, we're going to begin. Yeah. Excuse me. For some reason, something changed with this where it doesn't hit full screen on view. Window bring to front. Can somebody give me some quick advice, because this is a new one? Oh, here it is. Sorry. Never mind. Never mind. There we go. Except for it's not in the middle. Excuse me again. Always something wrong. Escape. No, it won't escape. Guys, can you give me some help here? Something changed.
Paula, you just need to click right in the middle of the screen. That'll bring focus to where you need to be, and then the arrow should work.
No, I can't. What I want to do is shut it down so I can get to the beginning of the show. That's what it wasn't set on the beginning. That's what
Escape should work.
It's not sort of, but I'm not getting my screen back. It's not working. There we go. Okay. Sorry. Okay. You're looking at a painting of Joe Papp. Joseph Papp founded the New York Shakespeare Festival in the late 50s, and he is painted here by Paul Davis, who did posters for his productions starting in the late 60s. He started the New York Shakespeare Festival by showing Shakespeare plays on a flatbed truck that he took around to various boroughs in New York. And later in the early 60s, the city gave him the Delacorte Theater to turn into a home for free Shakespeare in the Park, which has existed ever since. And this summer, as a matter of fact, was the first summer in its history where they could not have the outdoor theater. In the late 60s, he saved the old Astor Library around the corner from Cooper Union from destruction and wanted to turn it into a home for theater productions, and he called it the Public Theater. It was actually called the Joseph Papp Public Theater, but people were still referred to it as the New York Shakespeare Festival. Paul Davis worked on most of the posters for the Public Theater productions for nearly 19 years. Initially, Joe Papp had made independent productions like Hair and said it was the New York Shakespeare Festival Public Theater poster, but it wasn't done by Paul Davis. And then he hired Paul to do all the posters for the shows since. And Paul did them for 19 years until Joseph Papp died. He told me years ago that the beginnings of the poster art were spectacular, and then later the stars of the shows had more and more control, and the posters became more banal, as often happens with theater work. At the time I was asked to design the public theater work, Paul was long gone, and I was just a brand new partner of Pentagram. And this was probably for me the most significant commission that I would have, because it would be highly visible in New York City. My London partners always seemed to be very visible in London, and their identities for places like the V&A or the pharmaceutical company Boots greeted you the minute you got to London. And I wanted to do something that was going to have that kind of visibility. I was hired by George Wolfe. George Wolfe had become director of the theater 2 years after Paul Davis died. And not Paul Davis, I'm sorry, Joe Papp. Paul Davis is certainly alive. And he wanted to do what he called cleansing the palate to make the theater feel new again, because it had gone downhill after Joe Papp's death for 2 years. So he wanted to get away from illustration and do something that would be different. And we settled on it being typographic. At that particular in time, and even today, this is what theater advertising looked like. They were sort of banal headlines and funny illustrations or photographs and sort of goofy logos. And if you look at mainstream Broadway theater, you'll find it's pretty much like that now. What inspired me was theater advertising from the 18th century, the way I saw it when I went to London. And in looking through a Rob Roy Kelly book, I came over these terrific R constructions for different fonts, realizing that I could represent the broad public by being able to create different weights that would make the name of the theater. And here is my original sketch for it and the way I saw the plays lining up. And I created this construction with my assistant from typography I had taken from CBS Records that was American Wood type. This was from the Morgan Library. And for a period of about 15 years, I'd been photostatting it and cutting it up and also using it from Xerox machines. We put this together by hand, because none of these things were digitized, in 1993, which is when I began working with this. Here were the actual newspaper ads, all done by hand, except for the secondary type, but they were real paste-ups and mechanicals. And then we began to create tons of promotions, and they were recognized almost immediately by people who had populated the public theater because they looked so different. I hired an art person who was a typographer to go down and work at the public, and he began doing handbills and things that we could print out easily on Xerox machines and distribute. And this went on for the first couple of years that I was working for the theater. The work became very visible because there was this wonderful thing called phone kiosks that existed in those days. For those of you under 20 and not native New Yorkers, these existed on every single corner in New York City. So if you put an ad on it, people went by it and they saw it right away. The phone kiosking and subway posters were done with a wood type every season, and they represented 2 plays. And this still goes on to this day. But the individual plays in the theater did not get that kind of advertising space. They were actually out on the street only once. These posters that I designed were designed to be sniped originally and to exist and live on barricades in New York City, which was actually illegal. And they never had enough money to really accomplish this nor purchase a lot of advertising. So the reality is that these posters that many of you know and have seen reproduced were really not seen by very many people. They were seen by people who went to the public theater, and they were seen by graphic designers because they got into shows and were in annuals. The reality was that most people who knew about theater were not aware of a change in identity from the public theater. They mostly remembered for a very long time Paul Davis's posters, which were seen much more broadly and advertised much more vigorously. They existed on spaces all in the theater district for years. These individual plays were done like anything is traditionally done. I would meet with George Wolfe, we'd find out what the content of the play was, and we would try to demonstrate it using the theater graphics. Some of these things you saw because they were in annuals. The ones you never saw never got into shows. Some of them were printed, like the Huey Long poster. Venus never, I think we printed 3 copies of Venus. The things the public did see were these full-page New York Times ads for Shakespeare in the Park. And this became part of the problem for the public theater's identity, because these were the New York Shakespeare Festival, which everybody already knew, and they didn't necessarily associate it with the public theater, which they didn't really know. So for a long period of time, the Shakespeare Festival was more visible than the public. We put banners in front of the public in 1994, and we filled the lobby with the work, and most people who saw the public theater graphics in person saw them here. Then in 1995, a show opened at the public theater called Bringin' the Noise, Bringin' the Funk, and this poster that I'm sure all of you know was for the whole season, and the other plays were all listed for it, not just specifically the play. It was also painted in another form for a period of time on the side of the building. The play went to Broadway and became a monster hit, and this one did get sniped on the street. And then we made a series of other posters that appeared in the subway. And then there was swag, and there were CDs, and there was a brochure that had this type that became associated with the public theater and also very much associated with this musical. And within these things together, people began to recognize the public theater. Then it went to Broadway, and if you'll notice, there's no public theater logo on it because it was a part of a production deal with the theater that showed it. So the Ambassador Theater is listed with the public theater listed above as typography. So people were not necessarily learning about the public from the fact that this was a very successful musical. And then Savion Glover, the star, became neutralized, and the type began to change gradually because this thing began to be copied, which was very bizarre. And little by little, we started changing it over a period of time because this is really what was going on. People were using it as theater advertisements. Other theaters picked it up and made things that looked like it. So to a degree, the public theater, which had never really established an identity, really lost its identity in the New York Times. And then of course, Chicago opened as a musical, and some of the type was similar, and they had a much bigger budget, so they wiped the public theater away. At that point in time, the thing seemed so knocked off and had become a style that I felt that I just had to change it. So I began changing the font every year. And I remember showing these posters to George Wolfe, and at that period in time, I was turning 50. And he said, "Oh my God, Paul is turning 50. Let's have a year of depressing posters." And we did. Then I got undepressed, I think, the next year and began using different typography, but used a lot more straight photography instead of the style I was using that was more flat graphic before. And then bit by bit, I would change them year by year. I would pick a font for the year and then we'd hold to it. And the posters would look somewhat similar, and then we'd move on to something else. And sometimes we did things that were completely off brand. Now, during this period, George Wolfe, after the success of Bringing the Noise, Bringing the Funk, had two flops. One of them was On the Town that went to Broadway after opening in Central Park and lost money. But worse than that was one called Wild Party, which was produced purely for Broadway, went to Broadway, was nominated for a Tony, had to stay open for 3 months when it was losing money, and he began to lose the endowment of the theater. At that point in time, they put a director and a budget director in under George Wolfe, and she created lots of controversy and a lot of fighting, which period she said to me that she was canceling posters, we wouldn't make them anymore, and she wouldn't need me again. And George was still there, and he hadn't fired me, she had. So I wasn't doing anything for the public that one season. Then George resigned, and Oscar Eustace became the director of the Public Theater. And George had, at the point that he had resigned, a financial manager that he liked. And the Public Theater hired me back and put me on the board because they had no more money to pay me. So they were honoring me by making me go to board and directors meetings, which I found long and boring and didn't want to be at. Oscar decided to make a 50th year anniversary identity for the Public Theater, and I revisited the identity by going back and redrawing the logo in Accidents Grotesque, thinking why not pick something neutral and make the style the way that we managed it, the look of the theater. We did this for two seasons or three, and during this period, the financial manager who worked with Oscar, who he had inherited from George, both she and Oscar had totally different opinions about what things should look like. So the following year, after fairly much success with this campaign, we began to really change it, but every year became sort of a little bit of a controversy. And in the final year, these are the amount of posters I made for one show, which had never been the case before because you had two people with two different opinions about what things should look like. And this is what the final poster came out like, and I think it's one of the weakest posters. At which point the clash between them was strong enough that the financial manager resigned and Oscar became the main director of the theater. That year I had done this Free Love poster, which was much easier to accomplish because I had a nice rapport with Oscar, but I felt that he had inherited me and he would never feel completely comfortable. In fact, shortly after I produced this poster, he called me up and he invited me to have lunch with him, and I was positive he was going to fire me. I went to the lunch and he told me that his favorite work was when I had first done the Public Theater, and could I go back and readdress the whole thing for him? So I did, at which point I changed the type to Knockout, which was the font that Heffler had designed off of the Morgan Wood fonts. We did a series of ads and a lot of materials where we connected all the things at the public where they really had one sort of normal unified identity. And we did this fairly faithfully for about 2.5 years until I realized it worked it looked good in advertising, but it was incredibly boring in repetition. And I found it very difficult to extend it. You recognize the identity before you recognize the imagery. I rather like two of the summer posters, but I felt that all in all, it didn't have the same, what I would call legs as the first identity. And so I began to disrupt it. Still, I continually felt that the theater wasn't getting the recognition it needed. These things worked well in the newspaper and they worked well as small space ads, but they weren't powerful enough or memorable enough unless a play was a big hit. And then you remembered the play and you didn't remember the public. In 2008, we also, when I was on the board, we also began working on the redesign of the public's lobby in front of the building. And at this point in time, I began to realize that I couldn't be on the board and do the identity in the lobby because it would be a conflict of interest because the city gave the public money and I couldn't theoretically do the design if I was a board member. So I resigned the board because I didn't want to walk into the public theater and not have done the lobby, and began working with Jim Polshek on this lobby renovation. The lobby renovation, which still exists pretty much intact from the way we did it in 2010, used a lot of interesting devices. We incised the typography into the wall. We hired Ben Rubin to make this chandelier that plays all of Shakespeare's plays. And here it is in motion. They're hard to read, but they're all 39 plays around on these blades. Here's the information desk. And the permanence of this place gave me sort of newfound confidence and interest in really revisiting the way I was working on the public. And I realized that the amalgamation of the things I had made were stronger than they were individually. And that these posters that I had made to represent the public were really at this point kind of antiques in that they belonged behind glass someplace, but they didn't really live out on the street. And most of the things that were produced contemporarily had become digital. We did a campaign for the new season that was both digital and in print. And this one, it was handled really like a big advertising campaign because it opened up the public theater's new lobby. And we bought the last of the phone kiosks. We put it in the subways. We put it in subway cars. And it had its impact, but it wasn't the way I wanted to publicize the public. I wanted it to become a situation where the kind of graphic that existed on a poster could be seen in a broader and greater capacity, like the way the summer festivals were. So I began designing posters where the other components of the public theater were designed within the same style. So that these are signs for the Delacorte Theater, and it also is the same color system and design we use for Joe's Pub. Then I began to extend it to everything. And so we would design a season. The season would have its look, it would have its signage, it would have all the components necessary, and it could be put into a manual based on the components, and it could become every single thing the public made. The second season we did this, we did it as skewed typography. Every one of these things has their own device to them. And the people at the public theater actually refer to the seasons in relationship to the graphics. So they'll say, was that in the zigzag season or in the backwards season? And they've come to define it, and it's become their own personal language. If you'll notice, by the way, right in the middle of this poster is a title for a show that opened to the public that year that happened to be called Hamilton. And you would never know it would be an international hit from the fact that it existed within all of these things. But when it went to Broadway, it was, well, the public maintained a royalty and took credit for it. It belonged to the theater that it was produced in, even though it opened at the public. But a funny thing began to happen. And what happened with these things is that membership started to increase because people perceived all of the things that the Public Theater did collectively, not as individual posters that they recognized and never heard of the play after, so that you would buy into a season. If 3 of the plays were good, in many ways, that's all they needed. This is a sketch for what came to be known as the slashy season. And here we really got everything the public made into this system. I began to realize that I had not even begun to understand what identity does as I designed the Public Theater. I realized that it's impossible to know what's going to happen with technology over a period of 25 years, that it is impossible to know how audiences are going to understand things over 25 years. And as I began changing these things, I realized that what the Public Theater had become is my R&D. It is my research and development, that because it is this living, growing thing that changes season to season, I can experiment with what works and what doesn't, and then figure out how to reinvent it for another season. This one, which was the year that, I think this was 2016, and they made Julius Caesar in the park. Julius Caesar looked like Donald Trump, and there was a lot of criticism, and Delta Airlines went away and they lost their funding. And then JetBlue came back in and refunded them. And this thing made a controversy all over New York. And I realized that the identity had finally worked, in that when the Daily News put the story on the cover of their newspaper, they used a Public Theater image, not a picture of a celebrity or the person in the play or even the logo. It was the Public Theater identity from the poster, and it had made consciousness in New York City. This was 2 years ago. We began animating them because we could get kiosk space, which was new. And we keep looking for other ways to be able to position this thing in New York City. It's very expensive, but we managed to do it. However, what's happening now is that the whole New York public helps us out, because these things aren't designed for just the street. They're really designed for people's Instagrams. And so when you make them, people connect to them and they promote the theater for you. And what I found is that the engagement of the public is greater than it's ever been. And I feel bereft that we haven't launched this season yet, which will launch in September, largely because of COVID. And that not having the public be able to connect to it is sort of depressing. This is the way people really see these things, and they publicize themselves. For me, this was such an incredible experience and such a learning process that I wrote it down. And here's the book, and it's out with Princeton University Press and Princeton Architectural Press, and it's available online. And if a bookstore opens, it will be in one too. It was supposed to come out in April. We delayed it. It has 5 posters that you can open up and hang up in the back. Thank you very much, and a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Paula. I'm with you. We're really dying to get back to the space and be close to our neighbors in public theater. They've been such an amazing colleague to have. We've often staged events related to typographics at the public library restaurant. So it's an amazing venue, and it's I can't wait to see the posters back on the street in front of it. So thank you again once again for being with us and sharing this love story with public. We will move to our next speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce Vanessa Zuniga. Vanessa is also known as Amuki, which means inner silence in the Aymara Quichua language. She's an Ecuadorian designer, and her practice and passion has led her to investigate the visual signs of the ancestral cultures of the Latin Americas. She has made it her mission to design and share the Latin American cultural heritage and to amplify and to translate it globally. Her intention is to learn to appreciate and celebrate that heritage with pride and without prejudice. It's wonderful that Vanessa is able to be with us here today and share her wonderful work with this lovely audience. I want to remind people that we have a Q&A function. So if you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A function. And a note on that, we will do the Q&A in Spanish afterwards. I am not fluent in Spanish, so we've asked for help. One of our colleagues, Hen Ramirez, he'll be joining Vanessa right after her talk, and we'll handle the Q&A session. So thank you to Hen for being with us, and thanks to Vanessa for being with us. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Vanessa. Thank you, Vanessa.
Hi. Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. I thank Typographics for the opportunity to tell you a little about myself and my project. The talk is called Whisper from the Andes. During these few minutes, I will talk about the worldview of the original cultures that inhabited the Andes through typography and patterns, the ancestral knowledge that was minimized and extinguished and that are necessary to rescue, listen, and share. "16 years ago, I started the personal research project Visual Chronicles of the Abya Yala, to which I dedicate most of my time. That includes an immense curiosity, continuous learning, recurring visits to museums, talk with researchers, readings of Latin American books, and a lot of experimentation. Everything is linked to everything. I am because I belong. People were conceived and at the same time live in unity with the nature and the cosmos. Everything that exists, people understood and respected as it united to the existing whole. During the 16 years of the project, the results have focused on developing experimental and modular typographies, diagrams, illustrations, and thousands of patterns to share ancestral knowledge through them. My goal is to contribute to the construction of a Latin American visual identity through the graphic universe I have created to celebrate what we are, to amplify it, and to translate it globally. For you to understand my obsessive passion for what I am doing, I must show you where I come from and what makes me who I am. I was born in the south of Ecuador in a city called Loja, but I spent my childhood in different places with my parents, places that would mark me in my future choices. Abya Yala is one of the names this continent had before the arrival of the Spaniards. It means living land, blooming land. So in order to achieve the goal, what I was aiming for, I had to learn to look at what was in front of my eyes from another perspective. Now, I will show you a few experiments from the research project Visual Chronicles of the Abya Yala. Sara is experiment number 15. Sara is a Quechua word that means corn, and is the name of the experimental typeface that was born from the analysis of the visual signs of an arivalo. The arivalo from the Inca period were bottles that served to store and transport liquids. For this specific typography, we take the sign that represents corn and base. We will explain how our ancestors understood the cosmos. Javier Lajo, in his book Capañán, the Inca Route of Wisdom, points out. The next experiment is number 46, which I call the Andean modules. The modularity is the capacity of a system to be understood as the union of several elements that are linked to each other and that are in solidarity. That is, Each one fulfills a task in search of a common objective. In 2014, I selected some of the project's experiments with native Ecuadorian cultures to compile into a book. In its pages, you will find some modular typographies, pattern forms, patterns, and illustrations. I selected one of the module systems resulting from the simplification of the visual signs of the several archaeological pieces to show you below. And through the use of processing and the font maker, I generated many combinations. I'm showing you some variations, allowing me to obtain infinite results. In this example that I'm going to share with you, I use those modules converted into difference to mix them with illustrations. You can also see the union between modular typography and difference. This page was designed for the guestbook of the Bolivian Poster Biennial 2017, when Ecuador was the guest country. Okay, the final experiment is number 86. is dedicated to the Valdivia culture, which existed between 4000 1500 BC approximately. It was the first society of sedentary farmers and ceramists in Ecuador. In 2012, I visited for the first time the Casa del Alabado Pre-Columbian Art Museum in Quito, one of my favorite museums in Ecuador. In the section on the underworld or the world below, I found this rectangular piece that as soon as I saw it, I knew I should dedicate a whole experiment to it. The piece is called Cosmogramma. Alexander Hirst, a researcher of the Valdivian culture, points out that this being can be a representation of a shaman. The archaeological piece is a rectangular stone with 6 faces, 4 that look towards the cardinal points that possibly symbolize the transformation of the shaman into his alter ego. The upper face represents the eye that looks up to the night sky. That is the transmutation of the shaman or astronomer priest into an owl, so that his spirit ascends toward the stars and reaches the world of the gods. The face that looks towards the world below possibly symbolize the contact with the world of the dead. Based on the system of modules of experiment number 46, the piece Cosmogramma was simplified, and the lower part of this individual was replaced with modules of the system and with alphabetic and numerical symbols. To explore their three-dimensionality, I generated a series of animated posters that I call Valdivia Code, as well as the use of the modules as stamps. I am currently developing a card game with stories of the captors in the pre-Columbian period. The one I show in these final images is the capture fought between Pacha Duchisela, the legitimate heir of the Kingdom of Quito, and Huayna Capa, the sovereign of the Tahuantinsuyo, from whose union was born Atahualpa, the last sovereign of the Kingdom of Quito, and some consider him as the last sovereign of the Inca Empire, but that is another story. To conclude, I will share this excerpt from an interview on decolonization, culture, and society. To learn more about the experiments on display, I invite you to follow me and Beyonce on my social networks. And finally, thanks for listening. Special thanks to Mariela Condo, who, with her wonderful voice, accompanied us throughout this presentation.
Muchas gracias, Vanessa. Tu presentación estuvo impresionante. Vamos a tomar preguntas del Q&A. We're going to take questions. I don't know if we had time. How many questions can we take? But for now, Sesha Garwood is asking, how do you suggest other designers start tapping into their own culture and honoring? How did you begin? So, and Sesha está preguntando que cómo le sugieres a otros diseñadores empezar a trabajar sobre su propia cultura y cómo honrarla. Y también está curiosa sobre cómo empezaste tú.
Ok, ¿cómo le reduzco en eso? Toda esa respuesta.
Puedes hacerlo
Acá
en
yo
español.
empecé igual empecé todo esto como una tesis de maestría, porque ahí me di cuenta o me volví a enamorar de Ecuador, o me volví a enamorar de la historia de Ecuador o cómo nos la enseñaban. ¿Qué le aconsejo? Es acudir a los investigadores que hay en su país y a los museos. En los museos normalmente tienen una lista de investigadores y bancos fotográficos. Entonces, acudir primero a ellos y leer bastante. Ese sería como mi principal...
So she's asking that she recommends you guys to go to your own research center or libraries or academic centers that are studying your own culture. And that was the path that she followed. We have more questions and all of them are really similar about what software are you using and what is your process. Tenemos muchas preguntas que son muy similares sobre cómo qué software usas para tus animaciones y cómo abordas tu proceso de trabajo.
El proceso de trabajo me ha llevado varios años, como ya en 16 años que he ido perfeccionándolos, pero normalmente escojo la pieza que voy en la cultura en la que voy a trabajar. Primero leo bastante porque cada cultura tiene su propia cosmovisión. Entonces tengo que respetar mucho la cosmovisión de cada cultura y luego estudiar esa pieza. Tengo que investigar si hay trabajos previos sobre esa pieza que me puedan ayudar y luego que ya entienda recién esa parte, voy a la parte de bocetos y luego ya paso al ilustrador y luego sí empiezo a jugar con processing, con Foncel, a generar muchos módulos. Como se dieron cuenta, yo trabajo mucho con módulos.
Okay. Gracias, Vanessa. She's saying that the core of her work is basically research. So before any design, she goes and tries to research about the culture to make a really a deep research about the culture before designing anything. And she uses processing. And ¿cuál es el otro software?
Foncel Maker.
Foncel Maker. And she likes to work with modules. Y la última pregunta es de un asistente anónimo. Te pregunta que cómo encuentras el balance entre las letras del alfabeto latino en relación con tus propias temáticas. So an anonymous attendee is asking, how did you find balance between the letter forms from the Western alphabet with the form you are dealing in your subject matter?
Básicamente en la cosmovisión de nuestros pueblos ancestrales, todo lo trabajan basado en geometría. Si tú comparas cuando vas a realizar una tipografía, obviamente vas a ocupar geometría. Entonces, cuando yo encontré el clic o en la unión entre lo que estaba investigando y la tipografía, fue ahí donde nació mi amor, mi enamoramiento por las fuentes.
So she's saying that all the cosmogony of the culture or and the visual style of the cosmogonic representations it's geometric. So in that way, it was easy to do it into alphabets. Yep. Thank you, Vanessa. Alexander.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Han, and thank you so much, Vanessa. It was an amazing presentation. And when you have a chance, take a look at the Q&A and take a look at the chat. There's hundreds of messages. I think you've just won yourself an amazing following. The work is so beautiful and it was shared in such a lovely way. Your passion and your craftsmanship really comes through and it really feels very heartfelt. So I'm really excited. We hope we're back in person next year, and we hope to see you back in New York and to share more of your content. I'm really excited to meet you in person, but it's really lovely to meet you virtually. So, and thank you so much for sharing all this amazing work with everyone. So thank you, Vanessa, and thank you, Hen.
You're welcome. Bye.
Thank you. So we will be moving to our next presenter. It is my pleasure to introduce Eric. Eric, who I've known Eric through social media. We might have bumped into each other at an event or another, quite possible. I think there's a lot of overlaps within our circles, but I've been a big fan of Eric's work for quite a while, following his moves. But he's an amazingly versatile and creative director and typographer based here in New York City. His practice has an international reputation for pairing maximalist image making with typographic nuance for a variety of clients who operate in fashion, music, and architecture, as well as technology. He is currently the co-creative director of Mold Magazine. It's a publication about the future and science of food. It's a really amazing magazine. If you haven't seen it, check it out. Prior to that, Eric was global design director at Nike Sportswear and also the director of design at Sense, the place where he was able to form its inaugural design team. And he is here with us today to speak about his love of type. So thank you so much, Eric, for being here. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Sasha. Pleasure to be here. Thanks to all the organizers of Typographics. It's amazing that this is now accessible and streamable to everyone across the world. I actually don't get too many chances to talk about type that much without weirding everyone else around me. So I'm definitely going to savor this moment. Just a little bit about me. My name is Eric Hu. I'm a creative director, graphic designer based in New York, but I was born and raised in LA. And that's the subject of a lot of my talk. So LA has this rich tradition of graphic design, and it's shaped the field, but I'm not going to talk about these things. I'm here to talk about typography that's seen in the streets, particularly what I myself personally saw growing up. Because I would argue that the vernacular type in LA has had a much bigger impact on the world. And growing up in that city has given me this unique appreciation for typography and letter forms. Before I get ahead of myself, just a warning to everyone out there that there are mentions and depictions of racism and violence throughout my talk, and it will be apparent why that, it's hard to not mention these things. The history of LA, in my opinion, is dominated by two things. The development of the automobile, and two, its tenuous issues with race. And by race, I mean, its violent relationship to settler colonialism, immigration, colorism, etc. And where the two forces collide is where a lot of the most distinctive graphic vernacular kind of exists. The car is what made typography in LA loud, larger than life, and in your face, able to be read across the street at 40 miles per hour. And the multiculturalism is what gives typography its character. And a big part of this comes from the fact that LA was once a part of Mexico. So there's always been this huge Mexican-American population in the city. And before that, for thousands of years, LA was sitting on top of the land of the Tongva and Chumash people. So the concept of LA as an English-speaking city is less than 200 years old. But basically, in the mid-1800s, the gold rush brought in a bunch of migrant workers from all over the world, particularly workers from China. Now, the Chinese immigrants didn't really have it easy, and they had to deal with a lot of racism. In fact, the largest incident of mass lynching in American history took place in LA. The Chinese Massacre of 1871 occurred in LA, where hundreds of people went into Chinatown and basically murdered 17 Chinese people. 10 years later, the Chinese Exclusion Act became law, and this made it illegal for Chinese people to immigrate to the US. So again, like I said, there's always been Mexican Americans in LA for good reason, but without Chinese immigration, there was now this huge labor shortage, and this led to a huge migration of workers from Mexico and California. It's only gotten more intense by World War I. Now, these Mexican workers didn't have it easy either. The workers were low paid, poorly mistreated, and also a victim of discrimination and racism. And so they spent a lot of the next few decades like trying to unionize and fight for their rights. And this led to even more increased anti-Mexican sentiment. And this really exploded with the Zoot Suit riots in the 40s, where for 3 weeks, hundreds of sailors from a nearby Navy school took cabs going into Mexican neighborhoods and had this campaign of beating them up. And so neighborhoods that were predominantly Mexican started forming these protection groups to protect their neighborhoods from these white thugs, 38th Street, Florencia, Lincoln Heights, Boyle Heights. And these groups would eventually evolve into modern day street gangs. There's not a lot of photo evidence from that time period, but the names of these groups started showing up in these neighborhoods on the walls, and they were painted with a brush. And so this is sort of the earliest indication of modern graffiti in the United States history. This is decades before graffiti that originated in New York and Philadelphia, and it has a different aesthetic history. You notice that these black letter or Gothic letter forms had this old calligraphic tradition. Now, black letter has always been a part of Mexican culture before this. Some of the oldest Mexican businesses in LA have black letter signs. And a trip to Mexico, you'll definitely see a ton of black letter in the sign paintings. But we'll see how it takes a life of its own in LA. Transportation was also shifting in the 1940s. LA used to have the best public transportation system in the country. And, the streetcars were bought out by these like gas companies and replaced eventually with freeways. And so LA was slowly becoming a city that was built for the car. And, with more people driving, businesses had to make their signs bigger. By the 1940s, LA was already this mecca of neon and incandescent signs. But, during World War II, there were restrictions on manufacturing. So, there was still a big, hand-painted sign, community and patronship in LA. And so, many of you know that the sign painting program at Los Angeles Trade Tech is one of the oldest, and it's still the only remaining sign painting school in the country. And so even then, the sign painting format started accommodating the automobile, and the scale and the size changed. And that still, leaves a mark on many neighborhoods today. And it's easy to spot these hand-painted signs, even though they might vary in degrees of craftsmanship. And for people interested in hand-painted signs, there's a few books that are well known, and one of them is the Speedball textbook for lettering and poster design by Ross F. George. The 1941 edition, there's this page called Old English, and it's a guide of just these Gothic letter forms and how to draw. And there's a lot of speculation and evidence that the people that drew these signs, or placas is what we call them, were aware of this book. And you can really start drawing kind of the similarities and seeing like where the letters kind of evolved. I mean, in fact, growing up in LA, I never heard the term black letter or Gothic until I went to college. Everybody that I knew, we called it Old English. Two things happened towards the end of the 40s. One was the opening of the Colby Poster Printing Company in LA. And so they printed posters that were affordable, but also had this unique aesthetic. And, they shut down in 2012, but, for decades, like anybody that grew up in LA, saw these on, on telephone poles on the freeway, and it really changed like the landscape of LA. But also this other thing that happened towards the end of the 40s was the invention of spray paint. And, that was in 1949, and now you could paint really fast. The thing is, painting these letter forms would be very difficult with a can of spray paint, and you had to be able to paint the letters in a single stroke. And as a result, the letter forms began to evolve to match the tool. Francois Chastanet highlights this in his book about Cholo graffiti, exactly kind of how this happens. And within 10 years, these black letter shapes became their own kind of style. And by the 1960s, they were totally different. And, they had like kind of offshoots, and some forms were more round and some were more angular. And, looking at them, you could hardly really see the connection to Old English or black letter. But, the lineage itself is like very loud and clear. And so during the 40s and 50s, there was a lot of push for a stronger Mexican American identity through the Chicano movement. And that spilled into arts. And so you had this guy, Chas Bojorquez, he was educated at Cal Arts, and he really brought Chicano graffiti into the established art world and that lettering. This work in particular, titled Placas, is actually in the Smithsonian Permanent Collection. And around, by the 70s, the Chicano lettering started bleeding into other subcultures in LA as well. Surf culture was one of the first cultures to embrace it. There's this artist, Rick Griffin. He's responsible for some of the most iconic psychedelic posters of that era. He was a surfer out in LA, and he was exposed to this. And he did the album cover for the surf band called the Rank Strangers in 1977, featuring that like Chicano lettering. And it was like, it was kind of the first indication that this was going to evolve beyond the Mexican thing and into a representation of California culture in general. In Venice, you had the birth of skateboarding culture, and it took off, with Dogtown and the Z-Boys, they borrowed heavily from that aesthetic as well. And then there was also motorcycle culture. And then also just like the punk scene in Venice with the band Suicidal Tendencies. One of the members / artists, Rick Clayton, designed all their flyers, and he's also incorporating this type of lettering into their work too. And so you really just start to see this, kind of proliferate and enter into people's like visual consciousness. And, it's gone on to, by the time like hip hop came around, with Kid Frost in LA, with this track La Raza, this kind of phenomenon was already in full swing. But a bit more east of downtown during that time, there was also this other new wave of immigration. And it became legal again in the 60s for Chinese people to immigrate to the US. And so people from Taiwan and Hong Kong started moving to Monterey Park. This real estate developer, Frederick Shea, took out these ads in newspapers in Taiwan and Hong Kong saying that Monterey Park was going to be the next Chinese Beverly Hills. And so that brought a lot of, immigrants in new waves, and the cities in the city of Monterey Park just really started shifting. And as lots of Chinese speaking businesses emerged, so you had more kind of Chinese signs. But these weren't the typical kind of chop suey style signage that you saw in LA in the early 20th century. These were Chinese businesses serving Chinese people using Chinese characters. And also around that time, like vinyl lettering was largely replacing the hand painted signs because it was a lot cheaper. And, it put a lot of sign painters out of business because of the price. And so another thing was like a lot of Asian businesses utilized vinyl because there weren't that many Chinese sign painters as well. So there was really just like this technological and aesthetic kind of shift at the time. And that started creating a little bit of tension. People had, it made the white residents of Monterey Park, feel some type of way. And, in 1983, they tried to enact this law that required businesses to have their signs in English only. And, it would ban Chinese characters altogether. They said it was for safety, they said it was for accessibility, but ultimately, between you and everyone else in this chat room, it's ultimately a racist policy, and thankfully they shut it down. Now, this has a lot of meaning for me because, I happen to be a product of that. I was born in Monterey Park, and I grew up during a transition of all these like visual cultures. Some of my earliest memories were riding backseat in my mother's, Toyota, and looking out the window and just seeing all different types of letterings. In a single commute to downtown, I'd see some of the last remaining mid-century signs next door, next to all the Chinese businesses, and they were a block away from each other. I would see hand-painted black letter signs as we drove more towards the west side. Boyle Heights, I would see just the beautiful murals for El Mercadito. And, along the way there was just bilingual signs everywhere, and they had gotten much more sophisticated and much more interesting. But my favorite thing was, going on the freeway. Because, you know, by then, like New York graffiti had really made its way to Los Angeles. But the thing is that we didn't really have subway cars in LA. You know, we had freeways and billboards. So I remember just being like 5 years old, just looking out looking out the car window and just being like transfixed by what I saw. And there's this one piece in particular that we would drive by whenever we crossed the LA River into downtown. And it was this piece by Sabre in the LA River. This used to be the largest piece of graffiti in the world. It took him a year to complete. And basically, you know, if you could see this tiny little dot here, that's the writer himself. You know, so the scale of it was massive, and I just wouldn't know like how this was even possible. And even like the tagging and the hand style still had its roots in Chicano lettering. And you know, the script kept evolving. You know, Chaz Bojorquez influenced a whole new generation of graffiti writers, you know, who took Chicano black letter to a whole other level. You know, writers and artists that were influenced by Bojorquez have evolved their lettering style even further, like Retna and Usagro. And it's even, you know, exported its way out of Los Angeles to continents like Asia, you know, and Japan and Taiwan. And of course, you know, it's also just become more and more entrenched in LA culture. You know, Black letter is now this representation of Los Angeles. It doesn't get as mainstream as an NBA team. This is the city edition of the Los Angeles Clippers jersey that was revealed last year. You know, and as it grows more and more in popular culture, you know, there's more and more interested in the scholarship of it. You know, there's Netflix documentaries that now talk about, you know, this aesthetic in a lot of ways. And it's also just inspired this new generation of streetwear and fashion. And it really exploded in streetwear when, you know, Kanye West's Life of Pablo tour featured merchandise by Cali DeWitt that was really taken directly, you know, from Chicano graffiti. And, you know, full circle as of course, like, you know, if something's influential in fashion, it's going to influence graphic design. And this is now just part of the graphic design zeitgeist. You know, every art school in the country has a crit wall that looks like this. And, you know, it really feels like full circle. You know, I have, yeah, I have a complicated relationship with LA. You know, for many years, I wanted to leave. And, but looking back at my work, you know, I can't really deny the city's influence on me. You know, sometimes it's subtle. You know, sometimes it's more apparent, even if it was like unintentional. You know, and I wonder what it would have happened had my surroundings, you know, had been different. You know, like what if that law in Monterey Park had actually ratified and it didn't grow up seeing as many bilingual typefaces as it had seen? You know, what if there was a tougher policy on graffiti? You know, and, you know, I think about this quote by Jonathan Gold a lot. You know, just to paraphrase him, you know, if you think, you know, if you live in LA, you're used to having your city explained to you by people who come in for a couple of weeks. You know, they stay at a hotel in Beverly Hills and they take in what they can, you know, within 10 minutes in their rented car, and they write, you know, an essay about it. But what people don't understand is LA has this sheer magnitude and this sheer amount of cultures. And, you know, it's the fault lines between them that are the most beautiful. And so, you know, I close this just with, you know, just, I mean, a reflection. I think, you know, growing up in the city, I was surrounded by just these beautiful letters. But, you know, as I look closer and as I, you know, studied them more, they became, you know, stories about immigration, stories about migration, stories about race, stories about violence a lot of times. And, you know, I think, you know, when all of us draw influences as creators and makers, you know, I think it's worth just trying to see the history and to understand the lineages of the things that you know, that you are influenced and inspired by. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. There's a lot of really interesting questions that are coming in. I think that there's a lot of applause, virtual applause. I wish we could hear the massive stream of thank yous that you're getting. I think it resonated with a lot of people, kind of hit a lot of really great notes. It was really interesting to see this kind of stuff. I remember growing up, before I really understood what graphic design was, seeing a lot of this sort of what I guess in, you know, in the design history sort of lingo, the notion of vernacular, and like not knowing that distinction, just seeing this visual culture. And it's really interesting to see how there's a place for appreciation for that. And I guess like I had one question I wanted to open with is like, what's the, I mean, I just to frame it like in terms of there's a very fine line between honoring, respecting the culture and appropriating it.
Yeah.
And how does one straddle that, you know, like in someone's work?
Yeah. You know, I think that's definitely like a relevant, definitely a relevant topic. You know, I think cultural appropriation, you know, thankfully it's part of a bigger conversation. But I think, you know, cultural appropriation is often kind of misunderstood by people. I think on both sides, I think like, you know, part of the power of racism is erasure. And what I mean by that, it's erasing people's experiences, identities, and cultures. And, you know, what happens with appropriation is when a dominant culture, you know, takes something from a minority culture and really absorbs it as its own. And, you know, this is a little bit different than like cultural exchange where, you know, where two kind of cultures at equal footing kind of influence each other. And so the thing about appropriation is that it really depends on power. You know, like a kid in Tokyo wearing a Madonna shirt, you know, that kid in Tokyo doesn't really have the power to absorb Madonna as its own culture. And so this is where it gets a little bit kind of, you know, dicey with LA. And I think another thing about cultural appropriation is that there's almost like a Pandora's box where I think the reality is that I've come to just maybe try to understand it over a couple of years is that there's really no way to stop it. It's always going to happen. But there are ways to reduce harm and there's ways to mitigate things. And I think mitigating it is by, you know, crediting people, by letting people know where your influences take from. Also, you know, doing research and also like signal boosting the original creators of that work. Because it's often like Pandora's box. I think, you know, once like the Chicano lettering reached like the punk scene and punk became a worldwide phenomenon, you know, there's nuances within that because, you know, these kids were all living in Venice at the time and they were all kind of each other. And, you know, some of the members in these punk bands and indie surfer cultures or in these Mexican, in these motorcycle gangs were of Mexican descent, right? And so that's where it kind of ends up being like a cultural exchange thing at the time. But as it grew even more and punk became like kind of like this unstoppable force, as rap became this unstoppable force, you know, it ends up being appropriation. But there's this weird statute of limitations because like after enough permutations, you know, it's really kind of hard to really just put the genie back in the bottle, you know, like, you know, black letter is just like a trendy thing in graphic design now for just various different reasons. So I think the thing to do is to just really start by like scholarship and like being more thoughtful about the images that you consume, you know, and making sure that you are, you know, just not just like stealing something like outright. But yeah, I think it's definitely like, there's definitely a fine line and there's definitely a lot of nuances, but a lot of it is power. And the thing to remember is that power really, you know, power is also dependent on context. You know, what might be a black and white race thing in America, by the time it hits, you know, Asia, it's just seen as like American, and that, you know, represents American empire. And so maybe those like differences of racial hierarchies maybe like aren't as apparent in other continents and stuff. And so, yeah, it's definitely a lot of things to consider. I think we're still figuring things out as we go along about the right way to go about this. But yeah, I think like really as a creative person too, it's just like, you know, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when you're going to accidentally take something that you weren't conscious of. But I think the important thing is to also like to catch it when it happens and to also just evolve the thing to be your own thing too as well.
Yeah. I noticed like in your last slide, you quoted, you referenced the Typecast article by Somi Kim and Sojun Kim. I remember being in design school and coming across that article. It was published actually, like that was sort of one of my first entry points into like sort of the bigger world of graphic design. It was Barbara Glauber, one of our co-curators, curated an exhibition before my time at Cooper lift and separate, quote unquote, design in the vernacular. And for me, that was like an eye-opening experience, and I had to kind of discover that through a publication that I was privileged to have access to. And in that line, there's a question that came in through the chat from Tim Deschenay, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, but saying like, how do you think the internet has changed what we think of as local, regionally speaking visual culture? With the internet, like, we don't have to seek out or like stumble on this kind of publication that's a rarity potentially. The internet has opened that up. How do you think that's changing the design space?
I think, the internet has really collapsed physical space in a lot of ways. And I think we won't know its full effects until like at least a few years from now. I will say though that, we moved, I think, from a digging culture to a curation culture. I'm pretty thankful at the end of the day that I was born in the time period that I was, because, while I did grow up with the internet, I grew up with an early version of the internet, Web 1.0, where it was hard to find information and you had to actively find it. In college, in art school, like I still had to go to the library and like look for books and like know what to look for. I think with music, you had to go to a record store, until like I was, a young adult. Streaming services weren't really a thing back then. And now, on something like Pinterest or Spotify, you like one thing, it's going to feed you hundreds of more images or songs or whatever that you like. And, we're seeing that happen we're seeing what that could do to people. Like we see like our parents just having their brains turned to mush, because Facebook is just feeding them articles that might, like their, might align with their political views. And, I don't think we're that different. Like, everyone's Instagram Explore feed is a reflection of themselves. And so that's where it gets kind of into an echo chamber. And so, and I have done like teaching in the past. I've taught at Parsons and SVA. And at first I was like, really just like, wow, the young designers these days have access to Tumblr and like, Pinterest and like Instagram and all these things that I didn't necessarily have access to when I was a student. They're probably going to be super visually literate, but I actually think the opposite has unfortunately been true. It's just, everything's just kind of fed to them. And so, I think it's like a muscle in your head, the ability to dig, the ability to not be satisfied with an answer, the ability to keep searching. And so I don't mean this as like a whole generational write-off, but I do think it is like a muscle that maybe needs to be trained now, because, we have gotten a little bit too comfortable with having things like fed to us.
Yeah. There's time for a quick question, and maybe I'll ask if you could answer it in chat. I noticed in the chat and then the Q&A, a bunch of people are really interested in the book that you showed about the Cholo graffiti. So if you could mention the name of that, then
Yeah.
and then.
Definitely. It's also mentioned on this slide, actually. Cholo Writing, Latino Gang Graffiti in Los Angeles by Francois Chassanet. He's a type designer. And yeah, he wrote, this has also just like text from Chas Bojorquez himself. Yeah, it was a really helpful resource, and just really just getting the timelines and the dates right and getting like historical images. And I'll definitely leave that in the chat.
That'd be fantastic. Thank you so much, Eric. It's really good to have you here remotely, but there's so many like interesting things that just like pop in my head that I think there's a lot of response in the chat as well. I think it's really interesting to see this lens. I really appreciate you bringing this lens to us in such a thoughtful, careful manner. So thank you so much, Eric.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks. So we're going to segue into something right now that is a tradition for us at Typographics. We've been doing this since the first version, or first, Typographics 1.0 back in 2015. Seems so long ago. 5 years ago, we started a tradition of doing spotlights. And spotlights are a fun way to bring people who are in the audience to say a short anecdote, just to kind of change the pace a little bit. And we felt, even though we're on Zoom and we're in remote, we would still love to do a spotlight for you all. So we asked a lot of our friends in the community, in the wider community, to see if they could contribute something for us as a spotlight. So we have 2 spotlights today, and we'll have 2 tomorrow and 2 on Sunday, and they're short recordings, and we'll play one now. I will give you a quick sort of introduction on who the first spotlight is going to be. The first spotlight is by Flavia Zambargi. Flavia is well, a type designer and a visual artist. Flavia is a good friend. She's a graduate of the Typographics Extended program. I had the pleasure of meeting Flavia and having her as a student and now as a colleague. She's a partner at Undercase Type. She's originally from Rio de Janeiro and is currently based here in New York City. She is an amazing type designer, an amazing visual artist. She's worked with foundries like Frere Jones, Commercial Type, Adobe Fonts. She did an amazing piece for Adobe a few years back with some of the Bauhaus typefaces that they were reviving. So without further ado, I'll switch it over to Flavia for a short recording.
Hi Typographics! Welcome to my rooftop in Brooklyn, New York. I'm Flavia Zambargi, a type designer and visual artist originally from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. When Karen Sachi invited me to do this little spotlight video, I was obsessed by this thread on Twitter that asked, tell me why you entered your field in 5 words or less. Well, the answer didn't pop right away in my head and made me reflect on some old memories. I'm the only creative in my family. My parents, brother and sister, all aunts, uncles and cousins are either doctors or engineers. So it took me a while to remember what probably sparkled the interest to learn more about graphic design as a profession. My school ran a logo competition for its first ever science fair, and I won with this circular stamp-like design with a huge #1 look inside of a microscope. Look at those googly eyes, how cute. Clearly, my 12-year-old self was already into super thin hairline type and ahead of the geometric sense-ish trend. No need to say this was done pre-computer era with just compass rulers and ballpoint pens. Back in 1993, I had no idea I'd be drawing letters for a living, but here I am. Hope you enjoyed the rest of the event. Ciao!
Thank you, Flavia. It's really nice to connect all of our extended family for these kinds of things. So we will be moving to our next presenter. I will introduce the next person. Our next presenter is Kelly Anderson. Kelly is a designer and a paper engineer who pushes the materials of graphic design to their interactive extreme. And if you haven't seen her work, and you probably have seen her work, it's amazing and fantastic and magical. She operates in space between conceptual art, graphic design, technology. She's done amazing books, which feature working paper planetarium. She's built a book that's a pop-up pinhole camera. And also a paper record player, which is a phenomenal feat. As I said, it's truly magical. Wherever she can, she uses humble materials to showcase the surprising complexity and magic of the tangible lo-fi world. She has made work for NPR, The New Yorker, Wired, MoMA, and the New York Times. She also did the redesign of iconic New York City brands like Ross and Daughter and Momofuku. She teaches at the School for Poetic Computation and the New School in New York City. And she spent free time making typography-based risographs animations at our friends at the ARM. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Kelly. Thank you, Kelly, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Okay, I'm going to go straight into my presentation. All right, can you all see that? Great. So I am not a typographer, but I am working on an interactive pop-up book right now about type and technology. And so I guess I consider myself mostly a graphic designer, but I'm also a pop-up book author, an animator, a tinkerer. And in all of those things, I take an inordinate amount of pleasure in misusing technology to sort of figure out like what else we can do with it that's not its traditional purpose. So this project, which we finished all of an hour ago, is a really good example of this. So this is an animation that I printed yesterday at the ARM in Williamsburg from risographed frames. So what I do is I print them out on the Riso and then scan them back in and stitch them back together. And this was for the occasion of making an animated promo for Aglet Mono, which is the the typeface I'm using throughout this presentation. It was launched today by XYZ Type, Ben Keel and Jesse Reagan. And I'm including this in part because I want to include a tangent here. You know, New York City has been through a lot lately, but I think that the story really underscores like why New York City is such a magical place. So about 6 years ago, after Jesse and I already knew each other for a couple of years just through design circles, we ended up collaborating on a project for the New York Public Library, and this project got some acclaim and it got written up in the paper. And Jesse's stepmom noticed the paper and noticed that both of our names were in it. And I got this weird email from Jesse, who is consistently the most polite person I ever talked to. And he says, I hate to even ask you this. It's so weird. I don't want to make you feel strange, but are you Kelly Anderson from Louisiana originally? And it turns out that my grandfather's brother's daughter is Jesse's stepmom. So as kids, we hung out on the same farm in the remote town of Kurthwood, Louisiana. Unfortunately, there's no photos of us together, but this is me and my sister and my grandfather and great-grandfather. And yeah, Jesse and I totally drove around the same four-wheeler and careened around the same cow patties. And we, never would have met probably, if this magical city and this like wonderful community that we have here hadn't brought us together. So yeah, that's what I've been doing these last 2 days. And while I was over at the ARM printing on the Riso, I also did a fast collaboration with Jason Yan. He makes a lot of digital animations for Klim typography, and they tend to be like really slick, really pristine, really beautiful, and therefore extremely fun to like mess up these pristine surfaces with Riso noise. So I'm working with Jason for a little while on these types of things, and I hope that we find out we're related too, but I don't know how often that actually happens. So part of why I like figuring out how to misuse technology and get it to do something that it wasn't meant to do is because there's a lot of possibility hiding in our world in plain view. We pretty easily get complacent with the tools we use and kind of use them in the ways that are intended. And then the world ends up becoming a little bit more dutiful and dull. But within each obedient object or tool that we take for granted, there's this surreal side door, these rebellious possibilities waiting to be let out. And so my favorite thing to do in my work is to attempt extreme acts of transformation. The more radical, the better. For example, this is turning a piece of paper, a material that's traditionally considered non-technological, and folding it so that it can replicate the function of a more complex technology of a camera. This book is called This Book is a Camera, and it is a working camera and a book too. I'm the master of literal book titles. And it takes pretty good photos. They are large format, so they're 4 inches by 5 inches. So there's a lot of information that gets on the paper. And there's no depth of field because there's no lens. And so everything ends up kind of equally in focus. So we often don't think or talk about wonder as being like a force of subversion in the world. But I think that demonstrations like this have the potential to make a lasting and deep impact, especially when we're talking about providing experiences for children. I think it encourages kids to like look at their world a little bit sideways. So this is my other published book. This book is a planetarium, and again, disappointingly literal title. It is a book. It has a tiny planetarium in it, and 5 other pop-ups that recreate functionality that we normally associate with technology. So it's able to create demonstrations of how sound works, how pitch works, how time works, light, and even it sort of explains the basics of encryption and explains like how that becomes more complicated once you get into computer encryption systems. So this energy of finding and highlighting and being passionate about pursuing these invisible forces in the world used to almost exclusively go into designing infographics. So this is the work I did for many years. And this activity of data visualization is all about bringing facts from the abstract or numerical or invisible realm into the sphere of perception so that you can see those facts. So I thought, you know, as the next logical step, what about feeling those facts too? Like, wouldn't it be better to see and feel and experience those facts and have this multi-sensory reinforcement of the reality that's in front of you? What you're seeing here is a set of typographic origami tessellations that do that. They explain them, their purpose, they diagram their function, and then also you presumably fold it and you can actually feel what it does. And I'm really excited about this type of work because I think we intellectually think about the world through our bodies and through touch and through friction and pressure and through these tinkering modalities. I think it's downplayed like how intellectual and how useful that kind of thought can be in discovering how things work. You know, we're hardwired by evolution to have these, you know, very philosophical exchanges with our things. And I think if you talk to any artist about their practice, you can sort of get a sense for that, designers too. So yeah, we, me and you, we are awkwardly wedged in this purgatory between being physical, sensory, tactile creatures with thousands of years of evolution of thinking that way, and between this digital realm of information and commands and data that we're having to parse. Which this is my best theory why I'm so smitten with this dumb machine. I think I just like actually really commiserate it with being trapped in the same sort of digital analog purgatory as I am. So besides rezoing every piece of type that I've seen lately, this is the main project that I'm working on. I'm constructing type, collapsible type into a pop-up book. I've been prototyping this interactive pop-up ABC book with Letterform Archives publishing program to demonstrate typographic concepts and philosophy to show how type has been impacted by culture, to show where letter forms get their shape. And it's called Alphabet in Motion, a pop-up book for typophiles. So this is a rough prototype. We don't know if pricing will allow us to make a cover like this, but I really, really want a cover like this. So that's a possibility. It's also a possibility that it might be bright pink. So it's a little bit tricky to design for these 3-dimensional projects because you really have to prototype it and test it out to even make decisions about the color contrast and like whether it's optically doing what it needs to do as soon as those little fronds separate. So I've been working on this for a very long time. So with this book, I have the interesting challenge of working kind of in the inverse direction to the flow of this history that I'm depicting in the book. Because I'm creating mechanical, physical idioms. Let me see if I can get that to play. Yeah, mechanical physical idioms for what's happening in type technology, which has progressively become flatter, more 2D, more of a digital experience, increasingly moving away from the mechanical. But as I mentioned, like human beings, they remain physical. So these physical metaphors are often very useful. This is an alternate cover prototype that we rejected because it's too fussy, but it's a fun way, I think, of creating a physical analog for that expansive and contracting feeling of variable type and parametric type on sliders, of course, which we all think of sliders as being in apps, but they originally came from sliders in the real world. So it's just this funny sort of like back and forth between those worlds. Here is an ABC animation I made to begin promoting the book. And this title of Alphabet in Motion. So this is a nod to the fact that the book consists of animated pop-ups, that everything in the book literally moves and you can tinker with it, but it's also a nod to the content, that the alphabet is always in flux. And the essays that I'm in the middle of writing now for the book reinforce this notion that type is almost an impossibly condensed microscopic representation of an always changing culture. You can witness changes that happen in the world are also happening in type at this teeny tiny scale. So it's like a really cool, like compressed small representation of zeitgeist. These technological changes in philosophy and the history of ideas, changes in what we think the future looks like, what we want the future to be, changes in art. All of these specific cultural moments produce specific meanings and feelings and attitude that end up getting reflected in type in these really interesting ways. So I want the book to answer questions like this. When I see warped, distorted, projected type, why does that remind me of psychedelia? Why does it remind me of the 60s? For example, this proposed spread is going to be all about the aesthetics of light projection. So all about these 2D shapes that fall and drape across 3D surfaces. And this works just like with an iPhone. I'm using Amelia as my little sample phototype projection, but it's going to come with like a couple different fonts from this area. And you can create like a mini version of Joshua Lake Show in your bathroom. Or if you prefer, the plastic exploding inevitable with a velvet underground. Or even Brian Ginson's turntable meditation device, the Dream Machine. So this spread is really all about letting the reader play with the basic mechanisms of photo lettering and understand those concepts and understand why type starts being warped, why it starts bubbling. And so, photo lettering at this time had developed as an alternative to metal type and offered all of these new experimental possibilities. This is a book that I saw at the at Letterform Archive. It's called Psychedelic Types. This is called a kaleidograph. It's a type of photo lettering. There's many different devices for photo lettering, but this is all of these typefaces are designed by Ed Ben-Gat. And this is another rough prototype about another zeitgeisty thing is, why do certain typefaces like Eurostile and this hand-drawn version, really crummy hand-drawn version that I did of General Type's Palat, why do they feel so mod? This is an art that's created out of 16 little spinning discs that rotate 90 degrees each. My brain was sort of like one step into After Effects, one step into paper. And this is how it works. It's just these really simple array of V-folds. And every time you open and close the book, they go ahead and they rotate 90 degrees. So yeah, this is totally how it works behind the scenes. There's not much to this, just kind of crazy. Depending on which way they face, whether they face up or down, that will give you your angle of rotation here. And then finally, a circle is glued, which after I built this entire thing, I realized that obviously they need to be super ellipses. Because the answer to why this R feels so mod, like why Anagramma feels so super mod, you know, on the dashboards in 2001, A Space Odyssey, is mostly attributable to the fact that these letter forms themselves are built upon the shape of super ellipse, which is a shape that came on strong and went out of vogue pretty quickly, but is forever associated with the 60s. So the super ellipse is this post-World War II invention, which isn't quite organic, isn't quite geometric, but actually, you know, it requires a certain level of manufacturing precision to be able to make a shape like this. And so it came as soon as it was possible, basically. And the super ellipse was first discovered, if you can say that. It was first identified and named by the Danish poet Piet Hein in his 1959 winning proposal for the redesign of a roundabout in Stockholm. He discussed quite poetically about the aesthetic power and meaning of this shape, which I'm just going to go ahead and read this description as I go through a couple different designs with super ellipses. So he says, in the whole pattern of civilization, there have been two tendencies, one towards straight lines and rectangular patterns, and one towards circular lines. There are reasons, mechanical and psychological, for both tendencies. Things made with straight lines fit well together and save space, and we can move easily, physically or mentally, around things made with round lines. This shape, it isn't fixed. It isn't definite like a circle or square. You don't know what it is. It isn't aesthetically satisfying. The super ellipse solved the problem. It is neither round nor rectangular, but somewhere in between. It is a fixed, definite shape. It has unity. This is actually a super elliptical toy that he made. Yeah, but we see it appearing in all kinds of different typefaces. And this is just sort of showing how this falls on the super elliptical grid. And perhaps the most famous appearance of the super ellipse was in 1968, when negotiations in Paris for Vietnam War, they could not agree on whether to use a square table or a round table. So eventually a super elliptical table was fabricated as sort of like a physical analog representation of a compromise between these two opposing geometric tendencies. So I'm running out of time, but I'm just gonna show you a couple more just really quickly. This is my O, and this is accompanied by an essay all about the Lost Vegas Strip, the different mechanical signs there. Betty Willis, who designed some of the most famous signs on the strip. And this is a slice form pop-up featuring a G by Wim Corral. And this is accompanied by an essay where it just wholly focused on the idea of using a grid, but not following the rules. So using the grid as sort of like a creative jumping off point for experimentation, which I think of him as sort of one of the patron saints of that concept. Yeah, there he is. Haven't quite decided on the cover yet, but it does work, and it pops up and it pops down, so pretty good. Okay, so I think I'm almost out of time, but I went ahead and the book, we think the Kickstarter might launch later this year, but we're not sure because there's a lot of technical challenges still to solve. So on my book page, kellyanderson.books, I just put a link to my newsletter, and yeah, we're all going to announce it there. So if you're interested, I don't know. I'm super excited about this. Go there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I want to squeeze in some questions because I could just see my chat exploding. So virtual rounds of applause. Thank you so much. And I'm going to read a couple of questions for you. But it's super, super fun to see your work. I'm so glad you could join us and show off this stuff. It's really, really playful. There was a comment somewhere like saying, you know, play equals work equals play, which I think summed it up really well. But I'll read a question. Maurice, hi Maurice. Maurice is here. Maurice Milieu asked the question, if you could say something about your process, if it's not a secret. The tools you're using to make the forms, you're printing and turning into animations besides the Rezo.
Yeah, are you asking about the pop-up book or just the Rezo animations?
I think Maurice was asking about the Rezo.
Oh, yeah. So the Rezo animation, I typically use a hodgepodge. Like sometimes I use Drawbot, sometimes I use Open Frameworks, sometimes I hand draw. With this one at the beginning, with Jesse's animation, I actually drew all of the frames in Illustrator. So, and just used the tween tool there, just so I'd have optimum control in how the letters were moving, because otherwise they end up creating a tween that's a really odd shape. So I use those tools. I typically use the contact sheet automation feature in Photoshop to lay everything out on an 11 by 17 sheet. And then you can get Mr. French paper in 12 by 18, and the Rezo will take that. You have to keep your printable area to 11 by 17. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I do it slightly differently every time because it always seems insane. Like the process always seems crazy. I'm like, oh, there must be a better way to do this, and there never is.
And there was a short follow-up, and I'm also wondering about that too. Like, how do you choreograph the motion for some of these animations? Like, what's the process involved in that? Because it's super fascinating.
Well, I kind of like process intensive work because then I get multiple opportunities to fix things. And so I try to make it perfect when I'm drawing the frames in Illustrator. So if I export the pings, I can put them together quickly as a GIF in Photoshop, look at it in my browser, see if it seems to be doing what I want. And, you know, I get it as good as I can, but usually something along the process gets messed up somewhere, you know, and then I end up having to like hand draw it. Like there's a slight flaw in Jesse's animation at the very end with the S. I was missing a frame and had to draw one back in. So there's usually a little bit of cheating, like a little bit of Photoshop work at the end to get everything to work perfectly together. But yeah, I draw out. I'm just totally like lo-fi and manual. I'll take like a grid of graph paper, and I'll just figure out like what proportion of the time what action should be happening and think about like the tween, you know? So, you know, if something's coming to a rest, it's going to move pretty fast right here and then slow down as it comes here. So I find that kind of thought very meditative.
I think we have time for one question. It's a really interesting question. There's no name attached to the question, but I'll read the question. It says, "Hi Kelly, exclamation point. I'm incredibly fascinated by the intersection between dualisms such as visual and physical, or digital and analog. Your work obviously weaves together vision and physicality. Do you have any interest in exploring other senses like sound, smell, or taste, and their interaction with type?"
Oh yeah, that's really smart. You know, there is type tasting, so you should definitely look into that. But yeah, I read somewhere, and I shouldn't even say this because I don't have a citation, but I read that you know, our deepest, longest held memories are stored for scent. You know, and I've noticed this, that sometimes I'll walk down the street and smell a woman's perfume and be reminded of like my best friend in second grade, like her mom. And and I have that experience often with type too. And so I feel like, you know, the efficiency with which our brain stores that sort of like aesthetic and like sensual information and associates it with specific smells and type, that could be really interesting. I'm such a visual person that I don't feel like I have the skills to make that happen right now. But yeah, it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, I totally relate to that. And there, I was mentioning this idea that like once like just this like very strong scent came into my mind and completely unpacked this memory from like 20 years ago, and it just completely transported me. There's a technical someone said that there's a name for it, which I completely forgot the second that they were mentioning it. But it's a really fascinating nature. But I'm blown away by your presentation and the work. It's so lovely to see these animations and to see the inventiveness and ingenuity. Just really, really stunning to see. And we hope to see the book. A lot of people were asking about.
Fingers crossed.
Yes. So a few people were asking in the chat about some of the names of the books that you mentioned, especially your books. If you have a second to type them into chat, I think people would appreciate that. But once again, thank you so much, Kelly, for joining us remotely and for sharing your wonderful work.
It's such an honor. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Kelly. Okay, so we are going to move on to our next presenter. I'm super happy to present Javier Viramontes, who is going to be sharing some wonderful stuff with us. Javier runs a small independent design practice called Format XYZ. Format's mission is to allow people to make work of both objective and subjective value. Javier is a former student in the Typographics extended class, which is where we met and we stayed in touch. And now I'm so proud to have a colleague like Javier, especially when we talk about teaching type. So I'm super excited that Javier is here and he's going to share some of his ideas on education and typography. Things that are very close to my heart. So I'm so glad that Javier is here. So without further ado, I will just turn it over to Javier.
Thank you. All right, but before I begin, I want to first thank Sasha and Kara for creating such fertile soil in the field of typography. I also want to thank a bunch of people, Carly, Joey, Patrick, for helping me piece this together. Unfortunately, a ton of my documentation for this talk was stolen at a parking lot of an IKEA last summer. So, you know, it's always good to be in touch with people so they can give you materials. So I, like Sasha said, I run a small practice called Format XYZ. I am also a full-time lecturer at the University of New Haven, and I teach mostly type and intro classes. And like Sasha said, Format might act as a facilitator to help people create art, design, and anything in between. You know, the name of this talk refers to the film title of a documentary film by a gentleman named Kirby Ferguson titled Everything as a Remix. It also refers to the title of an assignment I give my students and of a 2017 workspace / exhibition at the University of New Haven, curated by myself and my former partner, Karina Eckmeyer. The show featured work of Typography 1 students, which were casually accompanied by very historically significant Swiss posters from the private collection of a gentleman named Tom Strong, who will make an appearance. In a larger sense, however, copy transform combine refers to the much more jargony phrase, process of cultural creation, sans all the political and implications that might want to insert themselves here. And before I continue, I do want to say that 2017 was a much more peaceful year. Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock hadn't appeared in this skit. And you know, it's given me a bit of anxiety to talk about modernism and Swiss graphic design in the year 2020. There's a lot of talk about decolonizing design education, and we're all in the process of trying to figure what that means and how it'll shape. But what worries me is that I genuinely love modernism. But I was comforted by a peer of mine who mentioned that a lot of these things become performance once they're professionalized. So I'd urge all the proponents of decolonizing a curriculum to expand the canon rather than to try to limit it, and to proceed with the highest degree in honesty and academic rigor. A few days ago, I was part of this small panel talk hosted by the Hoffman's Milken Center of Typography, where educators talked about the role of archives in design education. And one person stood out to me, which was Louise Sandhouse. Her brainchild, the People's Design Archive, is a crowdsourced virtual archive built by everyone, about everyone, wherever. I'd urge everybody to check that out. But never forget that the grid system is always watching you. The topic of this conversation actually has a very banal beginning. It started with a curiosity that comes at 2:30 a.m. With YouTube rabbit holes. Half asleep but fully awake, I wondered if Joseph Mueller Brockman had passed away in 1996. Had anyone bothered to record him? What did the guy really say? What did he look like? What did he wear? And then I started asking myself, did my undergraduate professors, faithful servants of Cranbrook and deconstruction, keep the truth away from me? And this all bothered me because I have to teach typography basics. So I was worried about what kind of lies I was going to tell the students. And so on YouTube, you can find the secrets of aquaponics, how to get 30-minute ads, how to make an automated sugarcane on Minecraft. You can also find the wisdom of a perpetually apoplectic Paul Rand. And you can even hear Muriel Cooper talk about graphic design that was years ahead of her time, but nothing on Joseph Mueller Brockman. It seems like the crown prince of an entire movement was nothing more than an academic concoction, perhaps a cliche of graphic design. I wasn't disappointed, and I'm not sure there is room for disappointment at 2:30 a.m., but I was quite surprised. However, life always has answers. Sometimes they're hidden on minute 17 of that aquaponics video on YouTube. But more likely than not, the answers lie in primary and secondary sources, like on the wall of the lobby of the Yale Graphic MFA studios, where they keep a rotation of original Swiss posters. And even my friend Aham mentioned that there's an old man that comes and switches these posters around, and he pointed at this sign on the wall. And that man's name is Tom Strong. He's a longtime resident of New Haven and a graduate of the Yale graphic design program back in the late 60s. A phone call that afternoon, we had a date for a gallery show, and we also had set up time for students to come visit his collection. Tom welcomed us in his studio and his house a few blocks away. Students got to ask questions. They were free to roam around. They asked him anything and everything. And the most awesome thing is that he knows everything about it. He has a personal anecdote for each of the pieces he collects. And he collects other things. He has a collection of Swiss fabrics, train models, stamps, political buttons, and a few other things, a drawn collection. But even though there's a lot in his collection, not every student is engaged in the same way. Everybody has an opportunity to ask what they want, but in the end, each person has their own history. You can see a student of mine, Patrick Anderson. He was acting as a photojournalist for the whole experience, and he eventually he was doing photography and is doing photography now, so he was able to apply his skills there. The plan of the exhibition was for students to learn like in the old times, where students would go to a museum and copy quote unquote a masterwork. But I wanted them to go further. I wanted them to translate the work, and they had the help of Tom to kind of give more context into each piece. Each student was set to iterate upon the past, adding onto the subject matter their own taste and their own experiences. I had a micro budget and a limited space, so the class voted to post their favorite works on the original Wall format size, which is 90.5 by 128 centimeters. This is a very small gallery that we have, and luckily everything kind of worked out in the end. And you know, they actively use this as a crit space, as a workspace. They got close to the work, and I think everybody kind of engaged pretty well. It's college, so some of these kids look sleepy, but you know, we were all there at one point. But I do want to highlight the work of two students, Joey Nicholas and Carly Greif. The work of Carly focused mostly on form, and she really iterated a lot. And she had a moment here where she liked this little bit in the middle, which was kind of like the move that she applied in the end. And she's a very productive person, and she kind of inspired everybody to really understand what I meant by iterative process. My other student, Joey Nicholas, when he graduated, he went on to start his own tech company, but in his own very unique way, where he developed his company's brand through very narrative-driven illustration. And in his sophomore year here, we can see that he gravitated towards his family's past. I think they're musicians. So they all kind of, that history just showed up in these objects. This is a leave behind, a little wind chime that I believe belonged to his grandmother and that I kept. And I had to tell him that I had it when I asked him for these pictures. And so, since critiques are kind of the final shows are kind of useless, Tom and Sasha came in and talked about adding more context to what graphic design and Swiss modernism really mean. I do want to say that the rest of this talk will be Tom Strong. I'll give you some of that lived experience that we had with our students, and you can see what I mean by him as a primary source. I do also want to say that I had a butter knife, a 10-minute edit, because he does have a lot to say. So without further ado, here's Tom Strong.
Yeah, we're not hearing the audio.
There's no audio?
No, it wasn't playing. Yeah, make sure you check the box when you do screen share at the bottom to enable audio.
Let me check.
Faced with the drafts in 19.
Can you hear that now?
Yes.
Faced with the drafts in 1950, I volunteered and fortunately was sent to first Germany and then Turkey. And then Germany, I learned enough German, which has still proved to be enormously useful as a collector of Swiss German posters and posters from the 1972 Olympics. I came back from that experience, having never been shot at, and decided that I was ill-prepared to do architecture, but that I had a burning interest to do graphic design, which I developed as a special student back in my hometown of Hanover, New Hampshire. And that resulted in a portfolio that brought me to New Haven, that then led to my meeting of my wife and partner-to-be, Marjorie Cohen. And by taking care, we grew slowly, We always answered the phone and tried not to price ourselves out of the market. And thanks to Marjorie, who's no longer with me, no longer alive, it worked out enormously well for me and for her. And today I have her daughter, who's a licensed lawyer in Florida, as my full partner. And it's all worked out to enormous advantage. I'm now 81. Don't tell anyone.
I won't. I'll cut this out. So you mentioned you started with Odell Eicher, these Olympic posters. What else do you collect?
Yes. Eicher, I had the good fortune to be at the Olympic site the year after 1973. Most of you will remember that Olympics as the scene of a horrendous murder of Israeli athletes. But lo and behold, at the site, I found the guy who had the residue of posters in the 2 larger sizes. And out of that, I was able to buy copies of the Olympic posters. Some are on the wall behind me, if you zone up.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone in the Strong family was offered posters galore. And I could buy them maybe for $10 a piece or less. So that developed a long-term interest, never totally satisfied in Otto Eicher's work. And then at Yale, where we were, it's hard to define the difference, but that we were aware of Swiss design through the magazines, which appeared in the Arts and Book Library right above our classroom here on Chapel Street. And so we would go without any urging from the faculty to inform ourselves. So what are they doing in Switzerland? What are they doing in Germany? What are they doing in Italy? And I found, in general, pictures the size of a cigarette container, but no big ones. And I said, darn it, maybe with any luck, I can find a way to buy the original posters in their full size, nearly 5 feet tall by 3 feet in width. Chris Pullman was on an exploration trip to Basel and Zurich to meet with Armin Hoffman and the staff in the Müller-Brockmann studio. Just incidentally, Chris saw people in 1964 or 67 or later cutting up repro to do the typographic posters for Müller-Brockmann's Musica Viva series. Both the studio and Armin Hoffman gave Chris Pullman a few extra copies, whatever he desired to bring back. And because Pullman was a friend of some years, he would give me whatever he could spare. And that was as good as rolling up the arm and finding a vein. And the collection all took off from that initial gift by Chris Pullman, who still teaches at Yale, by the way, having been at GBH Boston for 35 years. There's nothing, because if you look at a poster at this scale, which is about this size in a book, you learn something. But if you see it the size of what's behind me, juices start to flow, and you're able to look at it critically in a way that you don't want to do or can't do when it's very small.
Yes. Talking to you when I first met you, you had mentioned a few anecdotes that kind of shocked me, and they related to the Zeitung Armin Hoffman poster.
Yes, and he's here.
There you go, that one.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the image was executed by a student.
Yes. It's hard to believe unless you look at the poster full size. He asked the students, who must have felt that they were in purgatory, to translate a coarse halftone blow-up of the student, the athlete, into a linoleum block at final size. And they did. So if you look at it closely, you say that's not just an enlarged halftone, that's been cut in a linoleum block to take ink and letterpress printing. The poster was printed in 2 parts, which is all they could do at the school, which supported the museum in the building above.
So these are the kinds of things that you can notably see when
it's full size. Right now, this poster is in New York City in the Poster House Museum, a brand new museum, which is closed for now, but will reopen in August.
Oh,
And some
excellent.
35 of my posters are there.
Yeah, there's something very peculiar about how you collect. Where is your collection?
Early on, I figured out I can't afford to frame 1,000 posters. So probably 600 today are stored in rolls on a wire bookshelf. But it wasn't genius because someone else invented Passepartout. But I found that you could use polyester. Polyester does not shrink. So think of a sandwich. Polyester larger than the poster trapped in an envelope of foam core. So the foam core is at the back of the poster and Mylar is on the other side. And the Mylar is folded around the poster and then taped to the foam core. But that allows me, because these posters are all within a fraction of each other in size, that allows me to pull one out and put another one in. So I have about 200 of them wrapped in that fashion. But in a matter of minutes, if I run out of empty Mylar poster holders, I can put up a new display. Mm-hmm. And I carry it to the graphic design department, or I put it up in one of the residential colleges, which has a museum.
Yeah.
And I'll have to cut it early here, but I do want to say that he goes on to say that he does not wish people to collect because it's a very intensive obsession. But to go back to the earlier point, you might ask, what happened to Joseph Mueller Brockman? Did you ever find the video? Were you able to solve this mystery? And the answer is, magically, Tom Strong had the answer. I had run across a dead end where I saw a note on the exhibition catalog of 100 years of graphic design that one such video exists, and that was available there at the exhibition, I think in 2014. But Kimmy, I think her name is Kimmy, one of the curators mentioned to me that she couldn't give it to me because it belonged to RIT. I mentioned this to Tom, and he mentioned that Roger Remington of RIT owed him a huge favor. So a CC on an email later, and a few days, I got a DVD in the mail, and it was like seeing a father for the first time. Here, you can see a 2-minute clip of it. And I'm not going to show it to you because I would encourage you to go find these things out for yourself. In the video, you see Joseph Mueller Brockman fascinated by the translator here. He spends the first 2 minutes of his talk awed at the professionalism, about the semiotic symbols that this person is making in free and time. And so, you know, it shows us his curiosity. It's not part of the script that we know of Joseph Mueller Brockman. We see his curiosity. And so I want to give thanks to the following people for making this possible.
Thank you, Javier. We'll take a few questions. There's one that was like a short question. People were wondering which school the work was done in.
The University of New Haven, which is a short drive from Yale, which is in downtown New Haven.
Yeah, it's the school kind of in the shadow of Yale. It's an amazing school. With I was so thankful for you inviting me to see that review of the work. It's really lovely to see the work at actual scale, and you mentioned this, and Tom mentions this as well. There's another question that was really kind of about the process of the project, and the question is if the poster iterations are this, for the poster iterations, are the students limited to using the typefaces that is on the original?
First, they have to copy the work as it is, but they're free to iterate upon it. Of course, you have considerations as to the context of the poster. So within the conversation that I have with the students, they're free to go which way they want. After all, again, we have to move past the 50s and 60s and on to today.
Yeah, and I guess like on that note, just a quick question, hopefully quick answer, if you can, just this idea of how, you know, moving on to other things and keeping one kind of foot and one lens at the material. If you could maybe speak about the value of close reading of these objects, you know, in terms of how that might help transition students into seeing the work in today's time.
Well, seeing the work at such scale, you notice production methods, knowing what they actually say gives you context on as to what the piece is created. And hopefully that in turn helps the student realize their own context, their own history, their own needs, rather than just think of these things as style. They're active, living pieces that, you know, they should see such things as. They're not static museum pieces.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time for reflection of these things, and it's been really nice to see the evolution of the kind of online media to open up some of the content that's out there, being able to find some of these videos, and I hope the People's Graphic Design Project gets the attention it deserves. I'm glad to see it flourish, and I'm glad to see it posted in the chat. If people missed it, scroll up, find that link. It's a fantastic resource that anyone can contribute to. It will open up so many doors, and it will sort of more light into things and truly kind of expand the canon. So I appreciate that, Javier, you brought it to the attention of our audience, and thank you so much for sharing your process, your thoughts, and bringing Tom into this.
Yes, thank you, Sasha.
And that's really great. I didn't want to jinx it. Javier had in the is that the city or the internet provider lost internet. So I'm so glad we made it work. Javier was able to join us and present. It would have been a shame to miss those talks. So I'm so glad that worked. All our prayers were answered. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks. We're going to take a quick sort of breather, and share another spotlight with you. So stretch your legs, grab a drink. But we're going to take you to Barcelona. Our next spotlight is from Laura Messiger. Laura is a freelance graphic designer, type designer based in Barcelona. Her studio works for international and domestic clients, but also in the self-initiated project sphere. She runs her own type foundry, Typotones. Laura judges competitions, she teaches and gives talks and workshops all around the world. So she's going to take us for a quick peek at Barcelona.
Hello, I'm people of Typographics New York. I'm Laura Meseguer, type designer for Barcelona. And I'm going to show you two very nice, beautiful letterings that we have in my hometown. And both are based on mosaic. You have two very nice parts that say luz and fuerza. Luz is light and fuerza is strength. And there were two, let's say, things to promote the time of this beginning of the 1920s, where they wanted to promote the good things of electricity. Okay, and if we look at the details, you can see that there's a combination of construction. So on top we have the Roman construction of the letters, and in the sides we have the Italics. And it's a sort of modern typeface with a high contrast, let's say, and with these rounded serifs that makes it very, very interesting, because if you look at it in detail, you can see how the tiles are also a position following the round shape. And I found this extremely amazing. The detail on top, it's quite interesting to see that the serifs are rounded, except in the C and the R. Sorry, the terminal, sorry. And I don't know, I think it's quite interesting to look at it. And the more I look at it, the more details I discover. So I think it's a fantastic piece, probably one of the best we have in Barcelona. And here, what you can see is this plate that belongs to the city government of the Barcelona that gave recognition to the store as one of the historical places. Here you can see Amadeo Carbonell, 1924, that is the year of the opening, and 1989 when it got the recognition.
Thank you to Laura for this little quick peek at Barcelona and the mosaics in Barcelona. If you're not familiar with Laura's work, look her up, Typotones, Laura Messiger, and find her Instagram account. She posts fantastic pieces of Barcelona. So it's really nice to, through this virtual space, to connect the dots. And there's more folks tomorrow and more presentations on Sundays. We'll take you to other places in the world. We're gonna move to our next presenter. It's my pleasure to introduce Lisa Anabase. Lisa is a creative director at the famed Studio Dunbar. Studio I became familiar when I started studying design, and kind of stayed very much in my psyche when I was a student. It really kind of made an impression on my young impressionable mind, and I've continued to follow the work and been amazed to see the evolution of the work there, and you'll see some fantastic pieces. Right now, Lisa is directly involved with most of the main projects. She has done some of the projects like the visual identity for NGO Alzheimer Netherlands, the Transavia Airlines, and the brand refresh for the Van Gogh Museum. She is an MA design graduate from the Royal College of Art in London. Before Studio Dunbar, she also worked at Pentagram in London for several years. In 2004, Lisa co-founded and co-hosts the podcast station called typeradio.org with Donald Beekman and the Type Foundry Underwear. The wonderful interviews Type Radio produces is how I first became aware of Lisa's work probably about 15 years ago. So I've been trying to follow along with the interviews. They're really fantastic. The archive there has more than 500 interviews. If you don't know it, find it. It's very easy. It's on Google. Type Radio. Listen to these interviews. They're fantastic. In 2018, she was elected member into the very prestigious designer association, AGI. Alliance Graphique International. It's wonderful to have Lisa here. So I'll open the floor and leave the space and allow you to enjoy Lisa's presentation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Okay, let's start sharing. Share. Let's go. Thank you very much for the very nice introduction, and really thank you for inviting me to Typographics. So let's go. Last in line for the Friday talks. A bit about Studio Dunbar. I don't know how many of you know it. It's a studio that was founded in 1977, same year as the Star Wars first Star Wars movie. It's good that you know that. And we're 16 nice people. I like to emphasize the word nice, and we focus on identity and motion. This is who we are. Of course, Zoom has now become so much part of our world that we now eat Zoom cakes. You know what it's like. And we're in the Netherlands, and this is probably the flattest country in the entire world. This is a real picture, not Photoshop, true colors. Everything is real. And we're part of DEPT, and that is fantastic because we really have a really powerful digital backup, and that's really great. So a bit of the things I like to do, I'm, Type Radio, as earlier mentioned. Please listen to it. It's good for you. It's just as good as eating vegetables, so please listen to it. I'm a motion cheerleader, and because everything about motion I absolutely love, and I'm an obsessive book collector. This is at home when I try to put things in alphabetical order. I recommend you don't do this because it's a stupid idea to put your books in alphabetical order. Okay, so let's get to the point. How do we interact with brands, or how do we interact with identities? And the truth is, this is my life now. Well, yesterday or for the moment. I wake up in the morning and I am, I'm on my phone. I'm checking everything, I listen to the, it's the news, it's Instagram, I'm constantly, at least in the morning, that's the first thing I do. I know it doesn't sound like great, but anyway, in the daytime, most of my conversations at the moment are through Zoom. So I'm looking at these 4 dots most of the time, if the screen is not on. And then I have these meaningful conversations with people, dressed up as, Kermit. And in the evening, I'm back in bed with my laptop again on, either continuing to work or watching Netflix. I think most of you know that feeling. But what you see is that both our digital lives and physical lives have really become one. And that's something that we know. Look at this conference. This is something that normally we would all be there together, but now we are, which is great. We have this possibility to do that. It's all digital. And that's what you also see with brands. Most brands are just migrating in a purely digital realm, and they move from one platform to the other. And for ourselves, we're also using different platforms. So static is actually no longer an option. It is not possible that things just will be static. So motion plays a really, really important role. And I'll show you 4 examples where this plays a role in the identities that we create. So I'll start with the first one, and that's for Amsterdam Sinfonietta. And this is a string orchestra in, obviously in Amsterdam. They're world renowned, and we've been working with them for, I think, about 15 years. And we create all these posters for them. And every year, another designer in the team creates another series. So here you can see some of the poster we've designed in the last 15 years. And also the different ways of approach to the posters by the designers themselves. So 3 years ago, we came to the point where Amsterdam Sinfonietta said we wanted a rebrand or a change. And that's quite a hard question, because if you've designed the original identity and then you come back and you have to redesign your own identity, that becomes really, really hard. So you have to start questioning everything you already set for them. But this mark, or how we had designed it, was not ready for the digital world. So we had to really rethink, and some of the questions, or the essence of who they were all about quality, perfection, experiment, and innovation. So that really had to come back into the work, or how we designed for them. And this was our beginning point. We used processing, actually, where we could feed video and image to create different patterns within the typography. And we felt, if we're talking about innovation or excellence, we felt that this was the best way to capture their identity, because music is also always moving and changing. And here you see we made a tool where you could adjust everything. So you could adjust the size of the type. You could even adjust what you see in the typography. You can adjust colors. And from there, you could create any image possible. So here I can show you an example of that. Any language we wanted. For example, it could be more direct, or more playful. More romantic. And we could even take these stills and create, and here you see a few of the stills, and create actually all their printed matter. So we went from motion back to print. And then their posters again, because we kept the tradition going. And here you see the acronym, the AS, or you could even use the name of the musician or the name of the piece in the poster itself, or the different animations that we made. So the next example is motion in creating diversity. This is called Cumulus Park. It's an innovation park in Amsterdam, and we were asked to create the identity for this park. And in this park is really about a knowledge or an exchange of knowledge. There are students there, there are different, there are startup businesses, and it's all about collaboration. So how do you create, or how do you create an identity that shows that diversity? So this, what you see here, was our most simplest way to explain what diversity means. You know, like in terms of exchange of ideas, it's a simple, you give something, you take something, it's really a dialogue between two people. So this became the basis of the identity for this innovation district. And we could use it in all sorts of ways in typography, which meant that you, just by transferring particles, you could create a new letter form or new words. And with a tool which we could adjust also what type of particles we use, the size of the particles, and that would, you know, actually create the entire identity. And here you see it transforming from words, and you see the different shapes and parts that became the website, and went also back to print, signage, external signage. This is in, well, proposal stage, because this part of the building is still being built. And a clock. This was a nice extra at the end that we thought was fun to make. So then when it comes to what I like to say, motion for motion's sake, for Demo Festival. In the Netherlands, we have screens, digital screens in most train stations. And we had the unique opportunity to collaborate with Exterior Media, and they're the owners of these screens. And they commissioned us to actually design screensavers. That meant when you're not showing advertising, we could take over the screens in those spaces they hadn't sold and then make a design for them. And just to show you quickly, we made this for every city. We made a screensaver. Basically, we used the name of the city, and here it's Rotterdam. We designed a variable typeface, and here this one is for Amsterdam. And for the, actually for most of the stations in the Netherlands. So here you see the whole collection. And actually when it went live in the Netherlands. And what is, what was exciting about this project was actually, I mean, we make posters and we do see them and out and about, and we do, and our identities are, you know, all around the city. But what was really exciting was actually to see our work on the screen. And we thought, wow, this is such, it just felt such an exciting medium that we wanted to share this with other designers. We thought, okay, this is not, shouldn't only be for us. This should be for more, for more designers to also show their work on these screens. So we thought, okay, why not initiate the world's largest motion festival in the entire world? You know, why not just do that? So we asked Exterion, we said, okay, can't we do this festival and then show the work? And can we do this festival in Amsterdam Central Station, take over all 80 screens, you know, all the 4 video walls, and then show motion work from every designer in the world. Well, not every, one day, maybe every designer in the world, and then show them, you know, show their work. And Exterion Media said yes, and that was also unbelievable, because you think, you have this crazy, stupid idea, and you don't think anybody's going to say yes. They said yes, so we were like, okay, we're going to do it. And then what was also fantastic is that there were 250,000 people going through that station. That meant that instead of only admiring your fellow designers and just showing the designer's work, you know, to your, you know, just like in an in crowd, finally we could share this great work with a huge number of people. It was really out in the public. So we were starting this demo festival. So before you start a festival, then you think, oh, you need to make an identity. And that's where we started, and to design the demo identity, the design, you know, design for motion identity. And most ideas, and I mean, everybody says, yeah, you have to have this brilliant idea. And once you have that brilliant idea, then you have to sit down and then you make the idea. But I also believe, yeah, not everything has to come from that golden, you know, egg moment. You can also start, your ideas can come from the tools that you're working with. And one of the designers in the team, Elvin, was playing around with this tool on his iPhone, and he discovered that you actually can change the, for example, letter form from its core. And most of the tools we have don't have this quality. So we used that idea to bring it back to demo. So that meant that we could actually move every letter from its core, and we screen grab that. And we also base the idea of a grid, because if you're designing for motion, your grid should always move, and everything that you put on your grid is always moving. And here you see it also moving. The typeface is moving. The letters are moving. Everything that you put always moves. So when you put it, and on the website with your mouse over, the letters are moving even when you open the menu. And then on your phone, when you move your phone, the phone moves. And then, of course, then we needed designers to send in their work. I mean, we've had the space, you know, can you imagine you have 80 screens, 24 hours to fill in that space? You need people. So this was the call for submission. And we generated 2,700 submissions. And here's some of the results. And the best thing is just to see people just standing there watching the screens, like people just standing still, no advertising, looking at the beautiful motion. And last but not least, motion defining a moment. And this is for DNAD, sorry, just to go back, DNAD for Festival of Creativity. And this festival was called Imagine Everything. So what is hell for a designer? I want somebody to tell me hell, but I can't hear you from here. And I'll tell you what my hell is. My hell is having the perfect clients. When the client says, you can do whatever you want. You know that feeling, huh? When there's no limits. And then the other hell is, if you have this festival and it's called Designing Imagine and Designing Everything. Can you imagine these crazy two words? So where do you start? Where do you start? So we started with SpongeBob.
Imagination. Imagination. Imagination.
That wasn't the answer. We thought we create every image. We wanted to capture every single image on the internet. That wasn't the answer. Creating stacks of images. So then we needed to restart. And then we said, what is Imagine? And for me, Imagine is the beginning of every idea. You say, now we are imagining something is going to begin. And then what is everything? And everything for me is everything is I love you till the end of the world. You know, when you go as far as possible. And that came together to this. So that, and this was a great collaboration with Dynamo, where we tried to make the longest ever logo in the entire world so we could get into Guinness Book of Records. We still need to file that. And to create that identity, in the end, Imagine Everything is not only about design. Imagine Everything is everything else but that. And this is how we started.
It's a strange feeling saying your first words a second time.
That you have for conferences. And then COVID happened and everything became digital. As you see with all the typography, face filters that you can use. That's Thibaut, our wonderful intern, Josephine, our project manager. And then the ideas of all the images came back. And of course, you can't have a good festival without having cats. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm glad we end with a cat. It's a perfect way to sort of encapsulate a lot of this stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. And we're in Zoom. It's like perfect loop back. We're in Zoom. We're virtual. Cats rule the internet. So thank you so much. I'm gonna just ask a couple of questions that came in. I had one question myself that I've been wondering, because there's so many tools that are employed in this work, especially to make the animations. But even like to start ideating, like, do you think, and I don't know if this is like something you could answer, but perhaps it could be an interesting idea, but like, do you think that, do you search for the tools or do like sometimes the tools influence the making, you know, like the discovering a tool and that shapes the work, or the idea comes first and then you look for tools that could allow you to do that?
Yeah, yeah, it's both ways. I mean, you cannot, I think we search for tools, and some, yeah, like you say, we don't have a specific method of working. We don't limit ourselves like, okay, come with an idea and hopefully you'll find the tool. So like the demo project, there it was really the idea came from the tool itself. Of course, it had to move. So yeah, I don't believe in getting ideas in showers and things like that. Put it that way. I mean, I believe in taking showers, but yeah, you know, sorry. Anyway, but you know what I mean.
Totally. So there's a question that came up in when you're showing the work for like the train stations. Was there any pushback? Maria Galante asked, like, was there any was it an easy way to convince the client to install these like amazing animations in their station?
No, with the client, in that respect, that was yeah, they're very, very open, and that was what was really great. The hardest part was when we were organizing the festival, because we were showing about 400 pieces of work, and we needed to take care of the type of work we were showing. I mean, in a public space, like yeah, obviously you need to take care of what messages that you put out there. They're not offensive, of course, but also the work that was shown on platforms. If there's that it shouldn't be too distracting, that the train, you know, the train drivers would go off course. I mean, you can't really go off course, but you know, that they are in focus. So that was something. In the last minute, a couple of things were pulled out because they were a little bit too flashing and it wasn't appropriate. But that was more or less the kind of discussions we had, but not really, oh, I think this is, no, I would like, you know, more flowers, or, you know, these strange questions.
Yeah. Someone in chat, I think Alice Fukushima, said that she would miss the train with those mesmerizing typographic graphics, which really? Like I would be just glued to the screen. The very punctual European trains would throw me for a loop. But and there's one there was one question about I guess this is more like a Studio Dunbar question. What's the first thing you look for when hiring designers or an intern for Studio Dunbar?
I think it's their spirit, you know. It's like, you know, would you, I mean, we spend so much time together, like, can you know, hang out? Of course you look at work, and you look at good work. Everybody looks for good work. I mean, that is a given, but then we spend so much time together, and it's like, can we get along? You know, can we work together as a team? It's really a team, like, there is no, I'm not there to say do this and do that. It's really how the team works together and the chemistry of the team. So that, I think that is the most important. And I think that's also valuable to know for yourself, because I mean, you can be the best designer in the world, but sometimes you don't fit in a certain team. So you should never be down. It should never be a reflection of the work you're doing. I mean, you're still a great designer, whether you get to work in the studio you wanted to or not, but maybe it's not the right time I don't know, maybe 2 years later, it's a better time. Yeah, you did. Yeah, at least that's how we think at Dunbar.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering that. I think it's obviously the studio, like the culture and like the people in the studio, it kind of what defines the space and makes the work so magical. But it's really fantastic to hear you, to see you, to be here with all of us on this magic machine of Zoom and sharing this content. So thank you again, Lisa, for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Our pleasure. And for folks, please do check out Studio Dunbar's work if you're not familiar, and then certainly check out Typewriter. It's one of my favorite things on the internet. So thank you again, Lisa.
Thank you.
So we are exactly at 3 o'clock. So we're going to wrap this up. I'll make some short, really brief closing remarks. First of all, I wanted to thank every speaker that spoke today. And thank everyone who attended, watching us, listening, I'm sure across the world. It's really great to see you. Even if we can't see you, we can feel you. So it's fantastic to kind of be together. When we started this event 5 years ago, we didn't know whether it would be successful. We really took a risk and a gamble. And it's been really rewarding to see the community grow along the way. It's a lot of it, I think, has to do with the generosity and the spirit of this community. All the people that have come to speak, and everyone in attendance, and all of you are what makes this community, and you bring that spirit that makes this a really rewarding experience for us to keep going, keep doing. But we do have to acknowledge that there are still systemic injustices and that there are imbalances. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that Black Lives Matter, especially right now, and that we all have an obligation to do what we can to make things better. Everyone has a shared responsibility, and I think we could do a lot. We could do a lot more. What's happening in the world is encouraging us to strive to do more and to continue to work to ensure a more respectful and more inclusive community. And at Typographics, we're committed to continue to do this work and then try to improve every year as best as we can. So we want to make sure that our commitment shows, and we will continue to push on. There's an incredible community and that is visible here today, and a lot of this hard work starts with all of us. And so by connecting, by being together and breaking some of the boundaries between technology, or allowing technology to kind of bring us together, a lot of these things will be so much easier to do, to share and continue to inspire each other, continue to meet and converse and be in this like amazingly magical forum. And we will continue to advocate for you. We will continue to advocate for visibility and to try to show amazing work that's being made all across the world. We have more fantastic speakers tomorrow and on Sunday, so continue to tune in. Don't forget, I'll move out of the way, there's a book fair that's still ongoing. The link in the chat, you can find it on the website, and there's also an after party that was mentioned. It's in the chat. It's been posted a bunch of times, so do make an appearance in that. But also I wanted to close by thanking all the sponsors, without who this would be really impossible to do. The diamond sponsors, Google, platinum sponsors, Heffler & Co, gold sponsors, Adobe, A2A Studio Solutions, the silver level sponsors, Commercial Type and Poster House, and the lead sponsors, Mark Simonson Studio, Production Type, Claim Type Foundry, Cooper Hewitt, Glyphs, Occupant Fonts, Village, and Dual Type, as well as the brass sponsors, the lead sponsors, the pixel sponsors. All of these wonderful people have made this possible to bring this event, especially in this virtual way. So we thank them from the bottom of our heart for allowing us to do this. I also wanted to give a quick thank you to this incredible team of crew that have helped us put this on. Andy Villanueva, Juana Villanueva, Calapia Gajar, Belen La Rivera, Emilios Theophanos, Martin Rankins, and Eduardo Ayer Torres. We thank them immensely for helping us. And I also wanted to thank this amazing crew that we have putting this together. Cardi Eduardo, Waldo Tejada, Miranda Mellenbaum, Mark Rossi, Nick Sherman, Gabriel Rodriguez Fuller, Hen Ramirez, and Drenko Bujabasic. Thank you to them for putting this amazing program. We will see you tomorrow. Please join us. There's another amazing lineup. And we also thank you. So see you then.